Welcome to the webinar today, and thank you again to the QUT Centre for Data Science for allowing the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences to co-host today's seminar. And a particular shout out to distinguished Professor Kerry Mengerson, who's a fellow of the Academy as well. I'm Robina Xavier. I'm the president of the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, a wonderful discussion on the circular economy. In commencing today, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on where we're broadcasting from and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. We all know that the places that most of our universities are located from and our industry partners have been places of learning for many years. And we are deeply honoured to be able to, here at QUT, continue with that tradition. The Queensland Academy, which was officially launched in 2000, but has history going back much further than that, brings together those involved in arts and sciences with a particular focus on what lies at the intersections of disciplines and how we can think about that intersection to advance scholarship and to give advice in social and public policy on big issues. We give a voice to scholars, thinkers, and social commentators from a wide range of disciplines in furtherance of the Academy's mission. So welcome to all of our fellows and members who are with us today, as well as the members from the Centre and other interested groups. As with the other webinars, we will have a series of short presentations by our panellists, and then we'll open up to questions and contributions from the participants for today. And if I can ask you to use the Q&A function to do that, then we'll be able to see it all in one place and we'll work through your questions with the panel. Obviously, today's topic around circular economy can take us in many different directions. And we've purposely put a panel together that can provide contributions at many different levels so that we can see how each of the types of disciplines and areas can advance this area. And we will cover quite a lot of ground, so we might as well get started. So welcome first to Professor Rowena Barrett, who is Pro-Vice Chancellor QUT Entrepreneurship and Regional Innovation, and works with the academy, industry, and all levels of government to promote entrepreneurial approaches to big challenges. Today, Rowena is going to discuss with us how entrepreneurs are and can be agents of change in moving from a linear to a circular economy, with some examples of practice showing the interaction between the macro and the micro systems and individuals to facilitate that change. Thank you, Rowena.
Thank you, Robina, and welcome to everyone who's joined us for the webinar. It's really interesting to be able to concentrate on a topic like the circular economy because there are a range of different ways we can understand this. And what I really would like to focus on is around circularity as a business model and an entrepreneurial opportunity, but also the challenges of that as well. So as you know, looking at who are the participants, as many of you would know, I've been around and about the Queensland entrepreneurial ecosystem for the last 10 years. And so I can also point to some of the changes that we have in our environment, as well as how entrepreneurial and innovative activity interacts with those environmental changes to make circularity a thing worth talking about as we're doing today. So if we start with the concept of entrepreneurship, at QUT, we adhere to Howard Stevenson's 1983 definition of what entrepreneurship is, which is sometimes a bit different for what others think about it. And we talk about the pursuit of opportunity beyond the resources currently controlled. So we use that definition because it says nothing about the type of entrepreneurship that people can engage in, or that a startup and making money is the goal of being an entrepreneur. There are many other goals. There are many other ways to be entrepreneurial. But if we think about it in a non-circular economy, so in a linear economy, the opportunity is generally to harvest and extract materials, manufacture a product and sell it to a consumer, probably at a good price, and it might be slightly differentiated or it could be scaled and cheap, whatever the strategy might be. But really, a lot of what happens before or after in the business is not really the business problem. So it could be, but it hasn't largely been. So strategies within the business can focus, as I say, on maximising efficiency and effectiveness and the organisation of the business system to achieve organisational goals that have at its base being profit maximisation. So I think about an example, to try to bring this to life. And, you will all have sitting with you in your pocket or on your desk somewhere with you at this point in time, a mobile phone. And we know over the period that we've been using mobile phones, they've gotten smaller, then they've gotten larger, they've gotten lighter, they've gotten faster, they've gotten more complex, they can fold. They used to be able to fold, then we stopped, and now they fold again. But they also have within them this built-in obsolescence. So we know that over time you are going to have to replace your phone, and the software often won't work on older phones. And while starting out as being repairable, these phones used to be repairable, and then they stopped. We couldn't repair them, and you had to get rid of the whole system. It was locked. It was locked both digitally and physically. But entrepreneurs have tried to push alternatives to this. And I've got to say, my son was fascinated for years with the phone blocks. So it was a modular mobile that was never actually manufactured. It was talked about a lot, but it was never made. And it was about putting the pieces of the phone, choosing the pieces that you needed and putting them together to create your phone. But market uncertainty, the power of really large incumbents, and consumer attitudes alongside the technical complexity meant that modular phones, while they do exist, they're not widespread. But you can see that then we start to get some changes in the political, social, economic, and technological environments, whether it's regulation changes, policy changes, scientific changes, technological advancements, that start to then drive that. So the idea of a repairable mobile phone is well and truly back on track. Perhaps not modular, but at least repairable. So it can be opened, adjusted, and put back together. So we start to see the changes, and that comes from the right to repair regulation that we see in different parts of the world. So while we get these environmental changes that can start to stimulate changes, and maybe that will put modular mobiles back on the agenda, we also see it's an action of individuals. So the people behind phone blocks worked away for a long time on trying to make that work, but couldn't in that environment. Would it be possible now? Perhaps so, maybe. So, the legislative changes along with individual changes make a difference. And I think about my friend Yaz Grigalinas, who started the world's biggest garage sale, which is now known as Economy here in Brisbane. And when she started this, there were many people in the environment, and particularly in the entrepreneurial world, that just poo-pooed this idea of taking dormant product and waste and repurposing it back into the economy. Now, some of us, like me, who are die-hard op shoppers, we understand that that's not an odd thing to do. But for many people, it was seen as beyond. They couldn't really see the vision, but also the technology that was needed underneath this to understand how the system was working. So when Yaz, she had a pop-up shop in the Winter Garden, and some of you may have actually gone in there. She took waste product from Shoes of Prey, another amazing entrepreneurial venture that were off to landfill, all unique shoes, but waste. And she sold them. And she sold them and she made $100,000 in a 3-month or so period. And that started to change people's mindset about what was possible with waste. But she had to work hard to actually get that concept into people's minds. So what she was able to show was that now with Seconomy is that entrepreneurs can be vehicles of modification who find a balance between the old and new, between economic outcomes, social impact, and environmental defence. Waste is kept out of landfill. In her business model, she works with those who may not have had the same opportunities for work, and then she makes an impact both economically. So we can see this perhaps around soft plastic waste. We were all terribly excited when we could return our soft plastics, and Red Cycle were going to deal with it somehow. And what we ended up with was a collapse in the business and warehouses full of product that the supermarkets now still have to deal with. But there is technology that will enable that plastic to be repurposed and used, but there wasn't enough impact, wasn't enough happening in the macro environment that meant that would be promoted and made a bigger piece. So, another example that we have here in Queensland is Blocktex. Blocktex works with fabric waste. They're based down at Logan. Fabric waste, we know, is mountainous, truly mountainous, and it is growing by the minute. Now, if the fabric waste was simply just cotton or wool, for example, then it would be easy to deal with because we could just break it down back into cellulose and then convert it into other things, or we could respin it. But most fabric waste isn't easy to deal with because it's what's known as a monstrous hybrid. It's a mix of something with polyester in the fabric, in the stitching, in the elastic, in the notions, the button zips, the embellishments on fabric. And so most items are made for consumption, but not for destruction and reconstruction. So Blocktex uses a chemical process to separate the poly and the cotton. The plastic can be respun, ready for reuse and remanufacture, and the cotton cellulose goes into hydromulch and other products. To do this, they need a clean waste system for the inputs and a market for the outputs. So this is where we get to with circularity. Entrepreneurs start to make this change, but we then still need other elements to make that successful. They've also needed a bucket load of money and a lot of science to get where they are today. But most importantly, what we see is that the founders, Graham Ross and Adrian Jones, have needed persistence, resilience, and fortitude in the face of a lot of uncertainty, negativity, and sometimes failure. So it's that interaction that we get between the environment. It's become, clear that we need to deal with this waste, but it's what the people can do. This is why I think about entrepreneurs as agents for change, and why we can see this idea of circularity as a business model for innovation. But I'm going to stop there and hand over to Christopher, to Robina, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Rowena, and great to hear some of those live examples here in Queensland. And a shout out to Yaz, because she would have liked to be able to join us today. We thought she would add another great flavour to this webinar, but unfortunately she couldn't make the time work, but I'm sure she's happy to engage with us at a different time. So we did talk there about leading down to the science, and that's what we're going to do with our next presenter. So our second speaker is Professor Christopher Barnacollick, Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Vice President of Research here at QUT, and a Fellow of the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences. Christopher is a photochemist who uses light to make and understand soft matter materials with his two research teams, one based here in Brisbane and one in Germany. Taking the anonymity out of plastic waste is an important technical challenge, and we heard a little bit of that in Rowena's presentation as well. So Christopher is going to explore what needs to be achieved on the technological side, as well as the regulatory side, so that we can hold illicit actors and polluters accountable. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you very much, Robina, and thank you to the Academy for putting on this wonderful lunchtime event. As Robina has said, our research team is deeply interested on how we can break the anonymity of plastic waste. And before I go into a little bit of the technical considerations, I just want to outline the problem a little bit from an everyday perspective. We've all been in nature, to the beach, wherever we go, and we might be annoyed by finding plastic waste, whether that's be a little bit of a plastic bottle, a piece of packaging, or any other piece of plastic material that we find. And haven't we quite often wondered who's put that there? How come this ended up there? Who would do something like that? That's something we encounter in everyday life, but it is also encountered on a much, much larger scale in our oceans, where we see a lot of plastic waste floating in there, a lot of which then decays into microplastics that are very, very hard to remove and pose a considerable threat to fauna and flora in the oceans. There is also an enormous amount of illicit plastic trading going on across the world, where plastic is shipped offshore, for example, in Australia, not legally, but illegally, and people profiting from that. And this entire problem of plastic waste that ends up in places where it shouldn't be ending up has to be addressed and tackled somehow. And of course, legislators and governments of different colors here in Australia and overseas have pondered that question quite extensively. But it always comes down to one ultimate question of how do we know where the plastic waste came from, and how do we hold the people who put it there accountable, and who along the value generation chain from raw oil, essentially, all the way to the plastic material that holds a product is to be held responsible for the pollution or the illicit trading that happens. So to solve this problem, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could give plastic waste something that would be akin to DNA in a biological sense? So DNA, as many of you will know, holds information. It's an information storage system that nature has evolved over a long period of time, that holds unique information about who you are and how your body is to be constructed. And DNA, of course, is an important part of our criminal justice system, because if you go and inspect a crime scene and a perpetrator or an alleged perpetrator has been there, if you have a DNA sample from the crime scene, you can then match that with an alleged perpetrator that is associated with the crime at the crime scene. And why does that work? It does work because DNA is very unique to every human being. It's like a one-to-one match almost. And I'm saying almost because there are some exceptions, obviously. So what if we took this idea of that a human can leave a DNA trace, and any part of the human body almost can leave that DNA trace, whether it's a little bit of hair or whether it is a little bit of skin residue or whatever it might be, and transfer that principal idea to plastic materials. Can we give something similar to DNA to plastic? And to understand whether we can do that or can't do that, we have to delve a little bit into the chemistry of what plastic materials are. And plastic materials are made out of polymers. Now, what is a polymer? The word polymer comes from ancient Greek, poly meaning many, and mer meaning part. So a polymer is nothing else but a molecule consisting of many, many parts. Picture a necklace which has different pearls strung along the string that constitutes the necklace, a pearl necklace. And imagine all these pearls constitute one building block of the polymer. Then you have got a pretty good idea what a polymer looks like. Now, the interesting thing here is that similar to a necklace with pearls on it, we can give these pearls different colors, constituting or signifying a different chemical entity along the chain of the polymer. And that's how you make different plastic materials. So you've got a vast amount of variations in how you can constitute that molecular necklace to make different polymers. For example, the polymers that would be in your glasses, or the polymers that you have in a Tupperware container, or the polymers that are the coating of your car, or the fillings in your teeth. All very different properties, but the principle is the same. Now, interestingly, DNA, biological DNA, is also a polymer. It's just a biological polymer. But in this DNA polymer, the building blocks, these individual pearls, are arranged in a very defined way, and each carry a specific chemical function. And that is nature's way of storing information into the DNA. It's an information containing system that by your body can be read out and put into action. Now, what if we can make a polymer similar to DNA that also contains unique information, and we make this DNA-like polymer and mix it into the polymer that is produced by a plastics producer? And that is exactly the principal idea that researchers, including my team here at QUT, are currently following. You put information into a purposefully made special polymer, akin to DNA, and then you mix this polymer, because it is a polymer itself, into polymers during the production process, and that gives the produced polymer a very specific DNA. Now, that's fantastic, because that means even if the polymer is, the plastic piece is cut up, or you only have very little of it, you can still find out what that DNA is. Now, the big problem, of course, is how do you read that information from that special DNA, which is embedded into your polymer out? And the best way of reading things out is via optics. With optics, I mean, you shine light, like you shine light on a CD, in a CD player, and you get a specific signal back, and that signal you can deconvolute then to give you the information that is contained, for example, in your CD or in that very special polymer. So in some future, it perhaps might be possible that you will be walking on the beach and you will be picking up an annoying bottle, plastic bottle that is there, and you can perhaps even with your smartphone point the smartphone camera at this, and using the flashlight of the smartphone and the camera as a reader, find out what the specific DNA of that plastic material is. And if your smartphone then connects to a database, it will be able to tell you where that polymer was produced. And this is where our colleagues from the law department here at QUT come into. We've got a joint Australian Research Council discovery grant with them, and that's the team of Hope Johnson. And they're questioning what regulatory requirements would have to be in place to enable such a tracing activity, and where in the production chain of the polymeric material would we have to insert that special DNA into the polymer to identify it downstream. And you can imagine Australia being a relatively small country with not so much global part of the plastic production, that this effort has to be an international one. And that is quite challenging to do, but there are efforts underway to unify this plastics tracing problem on an international level. And technology that I've just outlined, putting a specific kind of polymer DNA into plastics, might help them to, in this regulatory framework, or this emerging regulatory framework, to help pin down where the polymer has come from. Now, the question who we hold responsible for a pollution event or polymer or plastics materials found in the ocean or in a river or on a beach, that is a question that policymakers have to answer for us in conversation with society. And there are different models being discussed. For example, could it be that the company that produced the polymer in the first place, one of the big chemical companies around the world, is responsible for putting the DNA into their polymer and then shipping it off so that they can be identified as the original producer? Or is it the secondary user of the plastic material? Is it a company that puts a beverage into a plastic bottle, and thus the coding would have to be very specific to that secondary company that then puts for example, beverage into the bottle? Or is it even the next stage? Is it the supermarket, for example, that sells the bottle to the end user that should be responsible for the identification, not the identification, for where the plastic ends up? And should we put information about that in there? Or should we identify every actor along the supply chain into this? And you can imagine these are complex questions to be answered. As chemists, we look at the technological side, hoping that we can make a system like that work. Whether we can actually implement it in real life, in the real world, in a regulatory framework, remains to be seen. And I would love to hear questions from the audience debating and discussing these questions and these aspects. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christopher. And as I mentioned at the start, that's the whole purpose of the Queensland Academy, is to bring the sciences and the arts and policymakers together. So your project is perfect. And we do have a couple of questions coming in on the Q&A. So if you've got questions starting to bubble up now, please pop them in there and we'll go through that as we go. We are also very keen at the Queensland Academy to ensure we look at the work of all of Queensland. And so I'm delighted that our third panellist can join us today, Professor Alan Dale, who's a Professor of Tropical Regional Development at James Cook University and is joining us from Cairns today. Alan leads JCS's contributions to Queensland's Rural Economy Centre of Excellence, the Communities in Transition program, and emerging approaches to collective impact. Alan's going to take us back up to the macro again now to cover the challenge of Queensland's regions decarbonising their economy while improving social, economic and environmental outcomes. He will consider the challenges and opportunities facing our regions in this important transition over the next 25 years. And I should also note that Alan is the Deputy Chair of the Premier's Queensland Plan Ambassador Council, which is monitoring progress against the ambitious plan. Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Robina, and thanks so much for this opportunity. And yes, I will be lifting up to the policy and planning sort of level of this. And my main contention in what I want to raise today is there's a lot of effort starting to emerge in Queensland and across the nation, of course, towards progressing towards a decarbonised economy. And I'd probably argue that we need to, in parallel, be pushing the conversation about decarbonisation and circularisation of the economy together. And that's an important step away from siloism between decarbonisation, circularisation. A lot of the pressures that are facing our regions are going to require decarbonised and circularised solutions. And it means that the planning and the thinking about it and the policy making about these things is going to have to be much more integrated. But ultimately, if we're going to decarbonise and if we're going to circularise our economy, it's going to take investment. And getting the foundation pipeline for investment in place is probably my primary concern. In the big debate about achieving net zero, about circularising our economy, It's very easy for regions to be feeling as though they're being put upon by the rest of society or the more metropolitan areas of the country to achieve particular outcomes. So it's very important that the discussion and the debate about decarbonisation and about circularisation is one that is embedded in trying to achieve regional development outcomes at the same time. We have to decarbonise and circularise while still achieving better social, economic and environmental outcomes and cultural outcomes within our regions. So facilitating achieving that, it's got to, got to be able to achieve both regional development outcomes while also protecting the key environmental and natural assets that we have. So some of the big challenges that we've got ahead of us, of course, are around being committed to actually achieving this, but delivering regional development at the same time as protecting those great assets that we've got. For example, the wet tropics region or the reef. We can't see significant development to achieve decarbonisation and circularisation actually taking us backwards in terms of the health of our key natural assets as well. And it's one of the reasons why there's a lot of debate in Queensland about bioregional planning and the integration and the touch points between bioregional planning, regional planning, and the need to avoid really major conflicts within our regions over these issues between the environment, between the aspirations of traditional owners, the opportunities that are there for traditional owners across the landscape, and the achievement of decarbonised and regional development agendas. And it's one of the opportunities, I think, when we think about the coming reforms in the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, the move to much more regionalised approaches for renewable energy zone planning, to be starting to think much more progressively about how we might tie decarbonised development together with circularised development in ways that really achieve better outcomes for our regions. So I'll just put that in as a bit of a starting point. But if we are to achieve any sense of actually decarbonising our economy and circularising our economy, one of the main points I'd like to make is that that transition support is fundamentally needed at all of the scales that these things are being considered. And when it comes to regional Queensland, effectively those regions outside the metropolitan southeast, there are a couple of higher level components of this that need to be thought about right across the regions before we even get down to regional scale. One of those is going to be the workforce and workforce development needs that we're going to have to actually build to achieve the foundations for decarbonisation and circularisation of the economy. And how do we actually build in situ capabilities as well as getting our migration and workforce development policies right. But we're also going to have to achieve this at an industry scale. So thinking at the whole of agricultural industry level, thinking at the whole of tourism industry scale, thinking at the whole of the critical minerals industry scale, right across our regions is going to be important as well. Because what works, for example, in the northwest of Queensland might equally be important in Cape York, or might equally be important in central Queensland. But it's really the regions where things actually tend to happen. So particularly the large scale regions, for example, tropical North Queensland, which is based on the service economy of Cairns, but the regional hinterland economies of the Torres Strait, Cape York, of the Northern Gulf, of the Cassowary Coast, of the Douglas Shire. So we need to be getting the sort of scales of thinking about circularisation and decarbonisation right at those scales. And we don't quite at the moment have the right institutional arrangements to actually get that right, to facilitate the strategic thinking needed at regional scales to make these things actually work. And then, of course, individual communities are all facing many economic stresses and many economic opportunities coming out of these new economies. But again, it takes some strategic thinking for that to work. But usually the capacity at local government scale, beyond, for example, Cairns, Mackay, Rockhampton and Townsville, the many, many rural and remote councils is often very, very limited. So it's extremely hard for those guys without transition support to be really thinking about how they pull off the investment pipeline needed to achieve these things. And then finally, these things, of course, as Rowena and others have been talking about, need to also be achieved at the business scale, small to medium enterprise in particular, and a household scale. So what support needs to be in place to make these things actually work at those scales as well. So I particularly just wanted to unpack a good example of some really solid communities-based thinking around decarbonisation, but more particularly circularisation of the economy, in the context of the biggest stresses that communities have been facing, This just talks through a little bit about the work that the Rockhampton Regional Council, very good work that the Rockhampton Regional Council has been doing as part of a thing called the Communities in Transition program, which was originally funded by the Department of Environment and Sciences as a way to encourage and support communities in this transition into a net zero economy and a more circularised economy. So the Communities in Transition process really fundamentally works right across the community to help set the vision and to understand the stresses and opportunities that are coming, and to really articulate the pathways of major development work that needs to happen to get investment into decarbonised activity and more circularised activity. But that work tends to then drop into major pathways and project initiatives that really then need to be invested in to bring the local capacity together to get to the concepts that need to happen and to get to the feasibility foundations that need to happen. That, of course, needs to transition into actual feasibility. There's some really complex concepts, both in decarbonised development and much more circularised economy. And then, of course, how do we get the private sector, the government concessional sector, working together to actually see all that happen? So achieving that takes a lot of effort, a lot of support. The Communities in Transition process in Rockhampton really worked through that very heavily. And one of their biggest issues that they really found was that they have a very significant amount of water coming online through new dam development in the Rockhampton region, but there was no process to actually really get the greatest value for every megalitre of water available through that new development. Some 70,000 megalitres of new water available. And on top of that, another sort of 100, possibly another 70,000 megalitres available for consumptive use in that region, but nothing that would really enable the region to get the greatest value and to be starting to position itself in the new decarbonised and circularised economy world. So Rocky took the strategic leadership to start to say, we want to move down that direction. And they focused on this initial issue for them, which was, we're building a dam, 70,000 megalitres of new water coming online, and we don't have a strategy in place to make sure that delivers the best and the most circularised outcomes for our economy. So working through a number of parties, very strong localised governance arrangements were established. 5 major interventions were designed and co-designed to get these things going. And it particularly ended up focusing on about five key things that I'm just going to tease out quite quickly. But the one was that we needed to start to think about where the nodes of development were really going to have to happen. How do we actually get integrated sharing and cooperative and waste management stream sharing between the major bits of the economy in those zones of development? And how do we actually sort of ensure that the planning and infrastructure is in place to make this happen? Quite often digital infrastructure being one of the most significant gaps. So this work really started to enable us to work out where the zones of development are, where the infrastructure gaps absolutely are, and how do we try to resolve those if we're going to attract decarbonised and next generation circularised economic investment. The second is pretty much about how the governance of the water market actually works. So very, very low productivity for water in its current form. The need to really work on getting the governance of water management, getting the trading systems in place, and really starting to see the much greater governing framework to actually improve water use in a way that's far more productive. And then starting to think through, if you like, the big circularisation opportunities at a regional scale that might really present themselves. So one of the big ones here that's come through is starting to actually process and trial the use of hyacinths as a circularised opportunity within the region. So we have major weed management problems, aquatic weed management problems, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars to manage purely by chemical treatment. And we've been able to get into place some really significant trials around the circularisation, harvesting, and the transition of that into quality fertiliser product, to actually turn it into market-based nutrient reduction mechanisms, and to sort of see a greater circularisation between what goes on at the paddock level, what comes off, and how we can see agriculture become much more circularised. And then finally, the last part of this is that a lot of new agriculture has been implicitly approved by the development of the dam, but we don't yet have the framework in place for actually ensuring there's no new net pollutants, nutrient, sediment, and pesticide emerging out of that. So we've got a very major project which is really working with every new water holder within the region to make sure we actually can achieve that, making sure that that process is not invented 40 times over by different water users, and really then stepping back and saying, what are the things we can do at the regional level to doubly check that we're not going to see an increase of nutrient sediment and pollution on the back of an increase of maybe 10 to 15,000 hectares of new agriculture in this really important reef catchment. So hopefully this gives people a bit of a feel for the sort of support that's needed in regions, some of the big emerging policy priorities and implications coming out of all of this from my point of view, how we make sure that the emerging Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act reforms that are happening can deliver this much more regionalised approach to thinking through these issues, because that's the framework through which major development, which is intended to be decarbonised and circularised, is going to happen. We need to get a much greater integration between the renewable energy zone planning, the water planning reviews that are actually happening in the region, and getting a much greater sort of integration between water and energy planning as a foundation, if you like, for setting up these conversations about regional scale approaches to more circularisation of the economy. We've got to put more support into our communities, like we did in the Communities in Transition pilot, but maybe that happens through the Regional Economies Futures Funds that the state is actually playing out at the moment to really support that council scale transition to decarbonised and circularised arrangements. But also we have to get the support into place at the neighbourhood, business and household scale to sort of see the business of decarbonisation and circularisation of economies work at those scales as well. The final part of the puzzle for me is really about workforce, research and development, and the way that the universities can play an anchor institution within our regions. James Cook University, Central Queensland, USQ, we cover the entire area, and we work through the decarbonisation hub based in UQ. So we want to see the university stepping into this space of being a much stronger anchor institutions around these issues. So thank you. I'll finish up there, and thanks, Robina, for the opportunity.
Thanks, Alan. And again, we've covered a wide range of topics there across our panelists, and thank you to the questions and comments coming in. I was interested that I was writing some notes, and before the presentation, a lot of the questions coming have sparked a lot of the things that I had originally thought in putting this process together, which is fantastic. So if there's other questions that you want, if you lodge them now, we're going to start at the top. And so the first question for you, Rowena, is about the consumer activist groups and their roles. So certainly there's a role for business and entrepreneurs and legislation, but often it's the pressure that comes directly from groups or consumers that get action, particularly when those political interests get involved. And we know we're in massive times of elections right across the country at the moment. How do we think about that? And I had, if you want to add this, I had a similar thing, because when I had proposed the circular economy, it was because I hadn't seen a lot on it for a period of time, and then there seemed to be a burst of activity. So while we know there's a lot happening in universities and industry, but how do we keep that public dialogue alive as well?
Yeah. Thanks, Robina. And Tiziana, thank you for your question as well. I mean, it's really critically important. You know, I'll go back to the idea of those modular mobile phones. One of the big projects was an independent business. It was bought by Google and shelved. So, you know, we can't rely on business doing good of themselves. Some of them, of course, will. And we can't always rely on government getting ahead of the curve either. So consumer pressure is absolutely critical. You know, it promotes issues, it raises opportunities, it, you know, helps us, you know, sharpen our thinking about why things need to change. You know, I personally think we're still really at the beginning of the process of moving to a circular economy. We're all still talking a lot about waste, but ultimately we need to get to a system where there is no waste, that we've designed out waste. So, you know, at the moment, waste is still a resource, a valuable resource that people are starting to do interesting things with. But the really hard thinking is, how do we get rid of all of this? How do we keep things flowing in the economy? How do we keep things moving in society? And Christopher will probably say, you know, science means we can't do that all the time. But yeah, consumer pressure, I think, is incredibly important.
Thank you. And that leads into our second question, which is for you, Christopher, and this whole sense of how are we actually changing the consumerism aspect or designing around. So currently 72% of plastic ends in landfill, 9% is recycled and 19% incinerated, yet 200,000 plastic bottles are produced a minute. We continue to buy bottled water, I'm guilty of that, in plastic under the illusion that it can be recycled. Are we sustaining the unsustainable from Tiziano? Christopher.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I would probably submit that we are indeed sustaining the unsustainable. And I would also subscribe to the notion that what we need to do is to design out the use of plastics. And I guess the problem is a scientific one to some extent, if you accept that plastics are inevitable and will be there. But if you accept that that doesn't have to be the case, then it becomes a behavioral economics problem, which in my view, saying that as a scientist who loves to, to construct these these nano DNAs going into the plastic. But I think designing it out and looking at it from a behavioral economics point of view is certainly the most preferable option. However, I will say one thing for plastics that are around. They're often seen in a negative way in many ways when it comes to pollution. But I would also submit that our modern lifestyle would probably not be possible without plastic materials. And while they have negative impacts on the environment, they also have quite a bit of positive impacts on the environment at the same time, because they are, for example, very lightweight. If you were to take all the plastic materials or the polymeric materials out of your car, there wouldn't be much left of a car. And if you replace that with metals, the car would be so much heavier, using so much more fuel or electricity, depending what sort of car you have. So I would advocate that we need to look at where the plastic material is used, where we should design it out, and where we shouldn't design it out. I mean, your example here with the plastic bottles is a particularly crazy one, because that's something that could be designed out on the spot, right? We simply don't need that. Yeah.
Thank you. And Alan, there's a comment in the chat, and I guess looking at those different quadrants you're working in, we often think about the social impact being around jobs, but the rights of people in different regional environments to have access to different things is also quite important, and getting that environmental impact and the social impact really strong. Could you comment a little bit about how you are seeing that advance, or any of the key barriers that we need to overcome?
Yeah, okay. This is an area working very extensively. And this is probably why I'm sort of lifting the debate about both decarbonisation and circularisation together at the bigger regional scale. We've got to be thinking about how do we achieve these things. And of course, we're rushing very strongly and necessarily, of course, into seeking to get renewable energy happening. But we need to remember, of course, that I'll just take tropical North Queensland. This is different between different regions in Queensland, but in tropical North Queensland, people quite often forget that we really are in an Indigenous domain. So traditional owners, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in my region, tropical North Queensland, have an interest in 100% of the landscape, and they have rights, very defined rights, both land, water, and in many cases sea, to around about 85 to 90% of that landscape. So it is very strongly the reality that new development, which is largely driven by particularly larger multinationals or larger national corporations, has to start with the foundations of free, prior and informed consent with traditional owners. So if we're going to achieve the social license that we're over, that we need for this to happen, both with our local communities, but more particularly with our traditional owners, it starts with the planning that's needed to bring us together to consensus about where development may or may not happen, or shouldn't happen. And that's one of the reasons why I want to get the bioregional side of planning right. And it's why that needs to be in partnership between the Commonwealth, the state, the regional communities, and the traditional owner landscape itself. But more particularly, local developments will generally affect maybe one, two, or a number of traditional owner groups. The copper string development, from Mount Isa to Townsville is going to impact on around about 11 traditional owner nations. Those projects, no matter what they do, their obligations now are to undertake free, prior, and informed consent negotiations right from the outset. And that means partnership from day one, not come at the end of the process and say, hey, by the way, can you approve this for us? So the aspirations of traditional owners are very strongly, as diverse as looking after country and culture, to achieving significant economic outcomes through employment and training and contracting opportunities. But increasingly, traditional owners see themselves very strongly as the partners, equity partners in this development agenda as well. So it's just a little sub-segment of the bigger problems and opportunities that I'm talking about in terms of this reform. But it hopefully shakes people a little bit more to realising that if we don't get this right, we'll actually lose the social licence for decarbonised development and circularised development. And we'll fall behind on our targets, and we will certainly see continued unsustainable economic activity be the dominant driver of the region.
We've got a question there from Legions around, how do we accelerate this transition, and what's the most challenging aspect? Is it from industry, government, or others? Who's the group we really have to push first and hardest?
So I particularly talked about those layers, the scales that we talked about before. The first one for me is really that regional scale. And if we're not good at rapidly moving towards some very solid policy work about where and how we want this to work within our landscape, then we're going to see very conflictual project proposals within the region. So some of you may have just recently seen a lot of conflict over the Western wet tropics, potential wind farm development there. One of these issues that could probably have been resolved by getting some high-level regional planning in place, but without that, developers come in with goodwill to invest. And at the same time, if it's not right from a community point of view, it draws community into major conflict that they may not need to have had if there was better planning in place. So it's a lose-lose when something like that happens, because we've got goodwill and positive investors to get halfway through a process and find that the rules are not very clear, and communities having to respond without much support. So very strongly the view we've got to get much greater federal state cooperation on those agendas. But then dropping down into those lower scales, that very strong support to increase the capacity of the councils, particularly to be driving new pathways that are decarbonised and circularised. But then the layers of support into the household, business and household scales as well. So my view is, if all of the large investment opportunity through federal and state support is through, for example, large federal subsidies, we just won't achieve what we're trying to achieve because we haven't invested smaller amounts of money down the bottom of the pipeline. And the big investments that have been announced recently in relation to hydrogen, in relation to critical minerals, they're all good investments. But I can't quite see the pipeline, the smaller amount of investment that's needed to get the pipeline actually working. And it won't mean we won't get there eventually. It just means we'll get there a lot slower.
And Christopher, with the interesting work that you're doing on this project, what's the next step that you're hoping to take?
Well, the next step that we're hoping to take is really solve the chemical challenge that lies in making this special kind of DNA that could go into the commodity plastic materials. There's a particularly high technical hurdle to overcome in placing particular chemical entities into the pearl necklace that then allow you to read out the information while that special kind of DNA is embedded into the plastic material. So that's what my team focuses on, and our law colleagues are working very hard at coming up with frameworks in an international context. There's an entire PhD thesis being conducted on this, and how international law would have to be modified at the level, for example, of the World Trade Organization to bring something like this into reality. But that certainly is a long road, and I think we probably have a technical solution first before we've got a legal solution.
Well, thank you again to our panelists. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I know there's a couple of other questions sitting there. We might be able to address them later. But thank you to Rowena, Christopher, and Alan for joining us today, and for all of the people online and the questions that you've raised. As mentioned at the start, the recording will be available on the website soon. And you might like to revisit the discussion through that or share it with friends and colleagues as well. This is a collaboration with the Centre for Data Science, and there will be a series of other webinars that are run by the Centre. But the next one that the Queensland Academy of Arts and Science is going to host is on the 27th of September on hate speech. And this is going to be led by the Academy's Vice President, Digital Engagement, Emeritus Professor Rolly Sussex. So if you're interested in that, you might want to put it in your diary now. It would be lovely to have you join us. Thank you for everyone behind the scenes who makes this happen, particularly in the Centre for Data Science. So Becky Cook, Chantal Toms, Tim McCougar, and in my office, Amara Nazim as well. Thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend with family and friends. Thank you.